So friends, we get back to Chesterton again, and this time to have a closer view of his writing and the persona that he adopts in the English essay, because it's Chesterton at two or three different levels. And as Professor Payal Nagpal has laid bare, the very plan that he has is that he'll first, undermine himself, and that undermining will strengthen his position, a kind of paradox that Professor Payal Nagpal underlined in the previous part of the discussion. So over to you again, Professor Payal Nagpal.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So I'll again begin with, a word that you have just used, and it's something that Chesterton is known for. He's considered to be a writer of paradoxes. So all his writing is meant to kind of put forth certain paradoxes that are there. And of course, his style is also one that makes use of the paradox. So we'll be discussing the essay titled An Essay on Two Cities, where he discusses London and Paris. And not that he privileges one over the other, but he's just simply using the form of the essay to present the way in which these two cities have actually shaped, in a sense, in the 20th century. So where he sees Paris as, kind of built on a sense of the 18th century logic and rationality, whereas London, he sees a kind of complexity to it, and yet, of course, there is also his characteristic signature wit that he uses. So in an essay on two cities, he writes that it is true that a great part of the distinctive quality which separates Paris from London may be even seen in the names, and he's talking about here the names of the streets. And he says, but if anyone has any real doubt about the matter, let him simply consider the names of the streets. And he says that, in London, all the streets are called, for instance, out of the Strand, are named after the first name, second name, third name, fourth, fifth, sixth of a noble family. So first and foremost, I think the essay, totally undercuts the tradition of a very long title and name of the noble family itself. And then he wonders, why is it that from the same noble family, the six names are going to be taken and planted in six different streets. Ultimately, he says, only one should be taken if at all you have to take it. So he says after their relations, connections, places of residence, and so he gives examples, like for instance, he says there's Arundel Street and Norfolk Street and Villiers and Bedford and Southampton and so on. And he says it goes on like this. So he makes fun of this association of the nobility with, the naming of streets, and he says these names are varied and he says they introduce the same family under all sorts of different surnames. So he says you have Arundel also, and you have Norfolk also, and he says you have Buckingham and Villiers. So he says to say that this is not aristocracy is simply intellectual impudence. So in a sense, I think Chesterton here is totally attacking the aristocracy at both levels. One, of course, the whole tradition of having, let's say, six names, to almost like six titles, and then, of course, to name streets after the same family. So he's totally attacking the nobility and their kind of claim to power, and how and the way in which this power perpetuates in society. He's very critical of that, without really, kind of overly telling us so in so many words. And so he come today, of course, there's a lot of work that is done on cities and so on. For instance, there is tremendous work done on Delhi itself. But he says that he uses the English essay to look at the city as a kind of sign, a kind of symbol. What does a city really indicate, and how is it that a city is constructed? So, a city has its streets, and the way in which the narrative of aristocracy is constructed by naming the streets after the family is something that he's critical of. So he says that to talk by statues is to talk by signs, and to talk by cities is to talk by signs. So he says in a city you have pillars, palaces, cathedrals, temples, pyramids, and he calls it, all these he calls an enormous dumb alphabet, as if some giant held up his fingers of stone. But he says the most important things are always said in terms of signs. and if they don't understand the signs, they will never understand the words. So he says, the idea that a city is understood in terms of these different symbols is important, but he calls a lot of these, he calls them an enormous dumb alphabet. It's not speaking in a sense, but it's probably kind of seeping into the society in a sense. So again, here, Professor Prakash, if you'd like to add anything to this idea about his views on the aristocracy.
No, actually, he has used the aristocracy in order to indicate the kind of emptiness and vacuity that they represent. And you cannot be immortal in society just by getting your the family names understood in terms of geography of the city. And he is lampooning these people. He is unraveling the the emptiness of the people and their existence, and that aristocracy has no business to stay because it's not there. So why impose aristocracy on the people just through the names that are included in the streets of the city? So I believe that even though it appears to be rather simple and simplistic, and in the essay, finally we realize that England is still groaning under the weight of aristocracy, and then there is that kind of royalism, and everything is done under the symbol of the Queen or the King. And if these symbols and signs are important, then the life itself, finally is belittled. So this is the point he's making. So I think the word that you explained as paradox is very clear here.
Yes. So in fact, it's 20th century, and still, despite all the industrialization, development, scientific development, and so on. So he's saying that if you do not call this aristocracy, that would be intellectual impudence, because this is aristocracy and the vestiges of it, that you're somewhere in some form still trying to keep the entire aristocratic fabric alive, even though it doesn't work anymore. It's no longer viable. It's no longer socially viable, and the world has changed. But one is still clinging to some kind of leftover of the aristocracy, and as you rightly pointed out, that England is groaning under the weight of aristocracy. So he says, he then raises the point about education, and he asks, what is really speaking the object of education? So he says it should be to restore simplicity, and it is not to learn things. He says the chief object of education is to unlearn things. So, today there are a lot of theory has given us a lot of terms like reading against the grain, or, kind of reading between the lines and so on. But I think he uses again the form of the essay to talk about the way in which this is missing in education. That education is being used to learn, to cram, but he says the important point is unlearning. So, the idea being that socially you kind of grow up in society absorbing and learning. So what you unlearn is what you have what is solidified and you have gained over a period of time. So the chief object of education, he says, is to unlearn. And what is it? The weariness and wickedness of the world. And to get back to that state of exhilaration we all instinctively celebrate when we write by preference of children and of boys, he says. So the idea is that, almost like going back to a sense of romantic thought, that in the state of childhood there is a certain freedom, and that is free of any kind of social conditioning that is there. So, he talks about unlearning this kind of wickedness that is there in the world. And of course, when we move on further in time and in Sartre's writing, and the whole idea of existentialism to exist, but also what existentialism has to say about social institutions. So, in a very nascent form, one can see this in Chesterton's writing. So he also says that this is completely missing in the popular form of education that is prevalent at that time. And he says that the children in London, they see London with abrupt and simple eyes, and London, he says, is far more difficult to see properly than any other place. He calls London a riddle, and he calls Paris an explanation. So it's interesting the way in which he poses these paradoxes, and he says that London continues to be a riddle, which also means that there is a certain kind of complexity. But Paris for him is a city that explains itself through reason, through logic, through rationality. And he says that the education of the child in growing up in Paris corresponds to clear avenues, exact squares of Paris. And so he locates the children growing up in terms of reason, rationality, and so how the child can go out and see the thing repeated in the shapes of many shining public places and the angles of many streets. So I think today there is greater awareness and a complete body of writing about the way in which a city is constructed. So the construction of these two cities in very, very different ways, and their connection with education and children, how a child learns to understand maybe the complexity that is there in London, and the child in the case of Paris sees a lot of what he learns out there in terms of the clarity that is there in the streets. So, because when the English boy goes out, he says, after learning about idealism and progress, he cannot see it anywhere. So he's also challenging, in a sense, the whole idea of Englishness as against the French style of educating. So to repeat this quote, but when the English boy goes out after learning about a vague progress and idealism, he cannot see it anywhere. He cannot see anything anywhere except Sapolio and the Daily Mail. We must either alter London to suit the ideals of our education, or else alter our education to suit the great beauty of London. So something is seriously missing, he says, in this particular connection between the kind of education that is being imparted and the way in which the city is evolving, the way in which the city is growing, and the fact that a child who probably learns about idealism but does not see it outside says a lot about the disconnect between the society and the individual. And so if one extends this to the modernist argument, then it pretty much falls into place, but also tells us how the style of writing that he has chosen to bring this idea forth is very different from the modernist style.
So I think the two worlds in the modern period, the way they are presented is really profound, in the sense, that in France you have the English, the French Revolution still alive. It happened in 1789 and it went on for 100 or 150 years, and that people remained enlightened at that point of time, whereas English people have already forgotten their revolution, which happened in the 17th century, and in the 18th century it was a kind of aristocracy that was brought back, at least in culture. So I think explanation is the right word, elucidation is the right word, and going back to the language and its efficacy in terms of recognizing change. That is important, which is not happening in England at all.
Yes.
So England, you still have the telltale idea of the aristocracy alive, and therefore you think you are you have that kind of grandeur, whereas the French people have gone ahead, and they understand their problem in very clear, rational terms. And the second thing is that in England there is no existentialism of the sort that is there in France, and existentialism is deeply rooted in the existence of the present life and all those things. So I think there is a point regarding philosophy, and he is very clear about the philosophical attitude that is developing more in France than it's developing in England.
So, in fact, the whole idea of reason, rationality, that a child who's studying in Paris is able to kind of identify it, replicate, and see what he's learned. He can see it outside in society. But what the child is learning, so on the one hand, is this entire narrative about streets, nobility, aristocracy, and England that's groaning under its weight. And on the other hand, is the system of education, which has created a fundamental disconnect between the child who's subject to that education system and London, which poses a certain kind of complexity. And so he doesn't, also somewhere, he doesn't resolve it when he says that, either we alter the system of education or we, change the way in which London is envisaged. So I think he's also pushing for a certain understanding of London in terms of its very, very complex heritage, and to call a spade and to say that, these are vestiges of aristocracy that need to be kind of probably done away with, and the idealism that is being taught, that idealism needs to be played out. So this is certainly an essay, and in the entire essay, Chesterton does not at any point say that London is better or Paris is better, but he's presenting to us, one may call it a paradox, but is presenting to us two different models of the way in which the city is evolving, and the way in which these two different cities are, and their people are kind of responding to it in the 20th century. So I think the time period, the construction of the city, these are very important factors in this particular essay. We now move on to the next essay, which is titled Woman. And here he addresses how a correspondent had said that communal kitchens will absolve women of entering the kitchen, and this will give them a chance towards higher culture. So he critiques this idea of the communal kitchen and says that the woman, now this is also again paradoxical and also maybe slightly problematic, but one will still take it up because he challenges this idea of higher culture, though at the same time he also talks about the way in which people who write like this, and again he presents the communal kitchen as some kind of a fancy idea, and he says that this is not something realizable, and he says it seems as if people have forgotten the existence of the working and the wage earning classes. So he says that those who write like this have probably forgotten this, and so he talks about the life of the ordinary woman, and say he says that women are generally very worried about housekeeping, and so he uses this idea of women and housekeeping, and he says that women are more worried about husbands and children, and he says, I suppose if we strangle the children and poleaxe the husbands, it would leave women free for higher culture, and it would leave them free to begin to worry about that, because he says women would worry about higher culture as much as they worry about everything else. Now, where this is problematic, because again, when he writes this essay called The Modern Martyr, he talks about the suffragette movement and Emmeline Pankhurst, and the way in which he looks at her resistance more as spectacle. So this also somewhere, because of his underpinnings, there are certain biases also that one sees, and it becomes difficult in that sense to unpack what he's writing here. So he says that he's talking about women and their higher culture, almost entirely a kind of growth of the classes that have always had a reasonable amount of money. So but the point is that should then the project of the association of women with higher culture be abandoned? But he says that he draws attention to the man he feels is totally not free as against the woman. He says the woman is like a despot at home, but he says the man is just not free. So if we if one kind of for a moment keeps the idea, his Chesterton's views on women and higher culture a little aside for a moment, then his narrative about the position of the average man in society really brings forth the pathetic condition of the average man. But at the same time, his point of view about the average woman makes the entire narrative very, very complicated. So he says that of the two sexes, the woman is in the more powerful position, he says, because the average woman, he says, is at the head of something, because she has she has the potential to kind of take decisions at home, whereas the average man, the man who's working outside, has to obey orders and do nothing else. he has to put one dull brick on another dull brick and do nothing else. So this is a little complicated because as mentioned, that it certainly draws attention to the average man and the dull life, the monotony, the mundane life that he leads, and he's constantly just taking orders. But at the same time, to look at the woman's position as slightly better is a bit problematic given the times. So I'd like Professor Prakash to
it's a difficult question you are sharing because he's talking about the exact period in which he is writing, and there are suffragette movements, and there are also many who are suffering at the hands of capitalism, at the hand of industrialism, and that they have no initiative left in them. So he is in the middle of that particular phenomena, and he can't perhaps follow it, but he's grappling with it. And if he's calling men to be subjected to that kind of coercion, then that's a fact. The left writers, the progressive writers would look at it differently, but the subject of the discussion in these essays, in my opinion, is the common person, the common individual, the common male individual, and that the woman has some kind of authority in home. So that can be contested by feminists later. But in the 1930s, when he's raising this question, then definitely women are in that governing power, and with that, they are able to dictate terms to the men also. So it's a kind of doldrum situation which can swing either in this or that form. And what finally will emerge, that Chesterton is not aware of that. And very soon he will die. He dies in the 1930s, and things are building up in such a manner that one doesn't have answers, but there are lots of questions. And very soon you will have the clouds of war visiting Europe.
So in fact, actually, this is since it appears. In fact, it's even before the 1930s because it appears in 1915. And so it is exactly parallel to not just the war, but the first wave of the feminist movement. So, and there were a lot of writers who did not take to the first wave of the feminist movement, and I guess Chesterton's argument vis-a-vis this probably falls in that category, because he says that the woman's world is small, but she can alter it, perhaps, but she can alter it. And so he, because ultimately women too are regulated by a patriarchal society. So, the power they wield within the home is, a very, it complicates the entire thing. And again, about higher culture is again difficult, because he says that, he says he would not set any man free for it, because he also sees this idea of higher culture as an elitist argument somewhere, because the effect of it on the rich men who are free is so horrible that it is worse than any of the other amusements of the millionaire. He calls this idea of higher culture, worse than gambling, worse even than philanthropy. So, in a sense, we need to keep in mind that late 19th century is also the period of Matthew Arnold and the whole idea of culture, that maybe culture can save us. But here he says that he is absolutely against this idea of higher culture, because he sees it as a very, very elitist sort of an argument. And he says that it means thinking about, he says higher culture, he says, amounts to just thinking about the smallest poet in Belgium as greater than the greatest poet of England. So he says it means losing every democratic sympathy. So he says he would favor anything that would increase the present enormous authority of women and their creative action in their own homes. But he says the average woman is a despot, but he says the average man is a serf. So one can see that there are, going to be issues, because as I said, this is a direct, the time period of the first wave of feminism. But when one looks at his depiction of the average man, of course, one cannot fault Chesterton on that. So, this is, and this idea is can be seen pretty much in the essay that's called Modern Martyrdom, where he talks about the agitators, and he's talking about the women and the first wave. So he says that I should advise modern agitators to give up this method of making a very big effort to get a very small punishment. And so he says that any kind of spectacle and so on. So he's basically talking about Pankhurst, and he names Pankhurst in the essay. He says that the modern martyr of the Pankhurst type quotes the absurdity without making the suffering strong enough to eclipse the absurdity. She's like a Saint Peter who should deliberately stand on his head for 10 seconds and expect to be canonized for it. So one can see that Chesterton is hugely uncomfortable with the first wave. But as mentioned that certainly when it comes to the average man and the depiction of the average man, he's certainly quite there on the page. So here
we are quite selective about this, that he's in fact not focusing upon the woman. He's using woman as a kind of tool through which he can understand the insecurity of the male. But in one thing he is very consistent in his argument, that the main enemy of society and culture at that point is elitism. And elitism is there in the outside world. And if the women are resisting, then it can be ironical. Then of course that resistance is supposed to be lauded and praised. And without knowing it, he is giving a lot of importance to the activity of women. That they seem to threaten the male, but actually they are threatening the elitism of the time. So it can be converted into that also.
Maybe, but Chesterton's views, he's using the women, he's using the conventional argument about placing women at home and then building on his critique. So that makes it problematic. But of course, like you said, that unknowingly and without his knowing it, he's certainly giving space to women. In fact, the essay that we discussed before, Modern Martyrdom, is titled Woman. And certainly when even though he slights Pankhurst, but nonetheless mentions her within the essay titled Modern Martyrdom. So the certain paradoxes are there, and he is considered to be a writer of paradoxes. And I think when one reads the essays, it's not. It would be a very convenient position to simply take up essays that are kind of making all the right noises about society and so on. But I think Chesterton here is writing honestly and poses a challenge to a certain kind of reading, and he too is subject to his time. And his discomfort maybe with the first wave, or his understanding of women within the home, though he also, because he speaks tongue-in-cheek, so it would be better to probably look at the entire argument within the framework of a paradox.
Maybe he's provoking people to think about it.
So it's good to probably look at it within the idea of a paradox. So he says that suffragettes who had chained themselves with iron chains to the railings of Downing Street, he says he calls it an ironical allegory of the most modern martyrdom. So he's saying that any kind of spectacle of this sort is to be avoided, and maybe a deeper analysis is required. So, but these are certainly the problems that Chesterton is posing in his essays.
Finally, Professor Payal Nagpal, how would you rate this kind of writing, this kind of intervention in the social reality, and the worth and the importance of this writer, in the context of overall literature?
I think Chesterton makes a very important contribution in terms of his critique of the notion of higher culture and the notion of modernism and the kind of writing that was prevalent at that time. And he's also making a very bold statement here, because his kind of writing was certainly not the norm. But the English essay needs to be studied for this reason. And I think in the 20th century, if in one line I was to just talk about his craft, his posing of the paradox and analyzing issues through the framework of the paradox, I think gives us a certain a turn to the English essay, which is of a very different kind.
I think it's a very fair assessment of the person who took up the job of addressing the audience directly, and direct is your word, in fact, that it's not indirect like modernism, but it's a kind of directness with which he is holding a dialogue. And in the dialogue, of course, there are two sides or more sides, and those sides, finally brighten up the atmosphere of literature. And this is what he's doing, either through humor or through raising these questions.
Yes.
So that way, we have understood the kind of complexity that Chesterton finally faced, and that before that, he was a very vibrant, a very vivacious kind of a writer who used language to good effect and was able to convert, an argument into a witty representation. So these are the points that Professor Payal Nagpal has made, and I think the worth is a great deal on the side of Chesterton as a writer of the English essay. So with this we conclude the discussion, and thank you, Professor Payal Nagpal, for giving such a scintillating lecture today on the English essay in the context of the 20th century writing. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Professor.
thanks, friends.